Finally, let's cover the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. This law prohibits employers from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities in hiring, firing, promotion, compensation, job training, or any other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. Once an employee has been identified as having a disability, the employer must offer reasonable accommodation during the interactive process. So what is the interactive process, and what does it mean by reasonable accommodation? Well, the interactive process is nothing more than when the employer and the employee begin discussing how can they provide reasonable accommodation for the disabled person and how they can do their job. For example, an employee that becomes wheelchair bound and can no longer fit the wheelchair under their desk. How could this be fixed through reasonable accommodation? Well, it could be something as simple as raising the desk up, or it could also mean purchasing a new desk for that person. The Americans with Disabilities Act defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. A record of a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, or when an entity, for example, an employer, takes an action prohibited by the ADA based upon an actual or perceived impairment. Well, a perceived impairment might be when an employer thinks that the employee has some sort of disability. For example, if an employee is perceived as being HIV positive and they're treated differently based upon that, even if they do not have that condition, that would still be a violation of the ADA. So we have to be careful that we don't act upon any sort of actual or perceived impairment. And we have to make a clarification here. Mitigating measures other than ordinary eyeglasses or contact lenses shall not be considered in assessing whether an individual has a disability. An impairment that is episodic or in remission is a disability if it would substantially limit a major life activity when active. So what this means simply is that if a disability is being treated, it is still considered a disability, even though the symptoms may be under control. We need to keep this in mind. These are some tips for compliance. First and foremost, it is critical that we review and update the job content questionnaires and make sure they truly reflect all the requirements for that job. We also don't ask applicants if they have disabilities or impairments. We also evaluate employees based upon job performance. If they're able to do the job with or without accommodation, then we need to simply stick with evaluating how they go about doing their job. Don't assume an impairment will affect the employee's ability to perform. We need to make sure that we provide reasonable accommodation to that disability so that they can perform at the level needed for that position. Also, do not ignore suspected impairments if they impact work performance. So when evaluating an employee's performance, you might want to discuss with the employee why the performance is not meeting standards. If they share with you the fact that they have a disability, that's when you engage in the interactive process and try to figure out a way of providing reasonable accommodation to this employee. Other tips for compliance. Do not retaliate against an employee asking for reasonable accommodation. They have a right to at least engage in that interactive process. Should they make a complaint to the Department of Workforce Services or the EEOC, the first question they're going to ask is, when did you engage in the interactive process, so that you can find some sort of reasonable accommodation for the disabled employee. Medical information must be kept confidential. Documentation should be handled by human resources. Keep in mind that most agencies have 2 different files for each employee. 1 file for personnel and 1 file for medical information. Only those with a need for that information should have access. Also, do not ask questions about an employee's health. If an employee's health is affecting job performance, you might ask them, what do you think is causing this poor performance? If they mention that it's a health problem, that's when you engage in the interactive process, and at the same time you need to work with your human resources professional in discussing how to accommodate this disability and engage in that interactive process. Focus your questions on employee performance. If you focus all of your questions on the employee's performance as it relates to the JCQ, you're on very safe ground. Also, offer reasonable accommodation if it's warranted. Once again, that should come out during the interactive process. Once a disability has been identified to you, consult your human resources office or professional immediately for guidance on how to engage in the interactive process and to try and determine what sort of reasonable accommodation can we offer this employee so that they can still meet the requirements of the job. Also, ensure that you avoid any form of retaliation, including those that may have participated in an investigation. So, let's review for a moment. What is considered a disability under this Act and is protected? Remember that under this Act, a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, or a record of a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, or when an entity, such as an employer, takes an action prohibited by the ADA based upon an actual or perceived impairment.